Okay, Ingeborg, can you tell something about domestic violence and PRI?
Yes, domestic violence is I think, a very important topic because it's very frequent. I would like to, in this context, talk about the domestic violence, which is, the more excessive types of situation in which there is not only verbal violence, but also physical violence or maybe sexual violence going on in the home. I think the first thing that is important to know is that if you are the victim of violence, you need to get out of the situation. You have to protect yourself and you have to protect your children because very often there are children involved. So it's good to know that there is a so-called, what I call false hope mechanism in which the victim stays or gets caught in false hope that the perpetrator is going to change. And the perpetrator, of course, very often will feel very bad about what he's doing and very sorry and wants to change. So he will say, well, I'm so sorry, I will change, I'll never do it again. We all know about these stories. But it's important to know that if there has been violence, you need to get out of the situation so that there can be some sort of help, so that the mental health care can enter into the situation, because in abusive situations, domestic violence, you often see that the system is closed off from the outside, so nobody can enter, and the circle just keeps going on and on and on, and it's very bad for both people involved because they're both victims of this violent situation, and especially for the children, of course. It's very destructive. So the first step is you need to acknowledge that if there's violence, you need to break the cycle and get out, get away, get help. So once you've been able to do this, which is very difficult, I understand, but recognizing that it's only false hope will help. Once you've done this and you've gotten out of the situation, then I think it's very important that everybody, including both people and the therapist involved, the people that will enter and start helping, that they realize that actually both people are victims. The so-called perpetrator is also a victim, as is, of course, the victim is obviously a victim, and the children are victims. But also, and that's what I really would like to focus on, the perpetrator is a victim. Because someone who is capable of horrendous, violent acts towards other people that are weaker. Children are weaker and vulnerable, the women in general, weaker and vulnerable, but sometimes also there's violence now more and more against men. Violence against another human being can only be done when inside of the person who is doing this there is a lot of pain, there is a lot of suffering inside. It's impossible to hurt someone else if you are not suffering on the inside. I always say the bigger the violence is that you are able of doing to others, the bigger the suffering is on the inside. Because the perpetrator has only become a perpetrator because as a small, vulnerable, dependent child, he was treated in a very violent way by the caretakers that he had. And if these caretakers were violent with the child, and the child didn't have any support, didn't have any help, all of this suffering is inside. And when the adult is in a relationship, this can come out either in the sense of becoming violent yourself, or it can come out in the sense of becoming a victim, looking for, it's like a repetition of what we lived through as children. Mm-hmm. So if we understand that the perpetrator actually is a victim of childhood abuse, childhood violence himself, what will this do? This is not to excuse the perpetrator's behavior, of course not. It has to be very clear that the behavior is unacceptable. It is the responsibility of the perpetrator to get a hold on his behavior. It's not his fault, however, because he was the victim himself of his own childhood abuse. So the first thing is that if we understand this mechanism, what can this give us? It can give the victim more of an openness to understand the perpetrator. Because the victim and the perpetrator, if they have children, they will be connected all of their lives. They will never be able to sever this bond. They have to find a solution to communicate, to somehow deal with the situation of being parents. So if the perpetrator and the victim can have a communication, because the victim can open up, understanding this mechanism, this will be very helpful. Secondly, very important, is that if the perpetrator can understand that it's not just that he's a horrible, violent devil of a monster, because these people have horrible self-images. I mean, they might not show it on the outside because they're too afraid to show it. But on the inside, there is a lot of suffering and a lot of self-loathing going on, which of course then is suppressed or denied, but it is there. So if the perpetrator can understand, well, this is really because I suffered this as a child and there's a lot of suffering inside of me, then the perpetrator might be able, more easily than is often the case, to admit to what he has been doing. Because we can only help a perpetrator once a perpetrator is able to admit to whatever acts they committed. And if they fear just being punished and being loathed and being condemned and being put in a corner like you're this monster, of course they're not going to admit to what they've done. So they first of all have to understand that this is the mechanism that they are a victim of, and understand that the people around them understand this also. And that will create a situation in which the therapists will be able to enter into a dialogue and actually start helping the perpetrator, which is so important, because then the chances of the perpetrator and the victim coming to some sort of a constructive communication will become more, the chances will be better for that. And this is very important because then, of course, the children will be positively influenced also. If we can help the perpetrator, then we can help him or her in the role of being a parent to the children, thereby helping to prevent the next generation in repeating the same pattern. Because if the perpetrator is not helped, if the victim stays, closed off, these two people will stay in very difficult situations together. They won't be able to constructively deal with the children. The children have already suffered from the domestic violence. They will have this in their system. They will have the idea, well, my father or maybe the mother is a crazy monster. This is not going to help them with their emotional development. And the whole cycle of violence, abuse, victimhood, and in the end the whole system where everybody is victimized by this transgenerational process will just, continue into the future. So it's very important that we start to understand what is behind the perpetrator's behavior, and that there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of powerlessness also. There are aggressive impulses that surge in this person that the person doesn't control. They are so strong that they take the person along, and then there are horrible acts which are committed. So if we start to understand that that's the mechanism, we can take a whole different attitude towards these people and start helping them, and they will be able to be helped. And there are very good methods, and PRI, I think, is one of the methods with which we can actually find the pain, the suffering behind the aggressive behavior, and we can heal this pain. This is really possible. And it's so important that we stop judging, that we stop blaming, because blaming and judging and punishing is only going to make it worse. It will not cut through this destructive cycle that goes on from generation to generation to generation. We need to see that all people involved in violence are victims, and that they all need to be helped. And we can only help them if they open up to us. And they will only open up to us if they understand that we're not going to judge and blame and condemn them, but that we understand, that we want to understand them, and that we want to work with them.